speaking.
Hey!
Round of applause for the one and only Steve Rosen.
Welcome to Ham Radio.
We're checking out.
How you doing?
We're checking out all the laundry list. But first off, I'm not going to lie to you. I have cracked the book a little bit. It is a very big book.
It is.
Tone Chaser. It's about the size of an old phone book from all you boomers out there. It is a big, fat, hardcover book. Beautiful pictures on it. Great picture of Eddie Van Halen on the cover of the book. Steve's on the back. Now, Steve, what instrument are you playing?
I'm sorry, say that again, please?
Steve, what instrument do you play?
Guitar.
All right, so Steve is on the back cover with a guitar. A lot of frank and candid pictures with Eddie Van Halen, who you hung out with for 26 years. And this is pretty much the culmination of all those interactive interviews or recordings or talking tos, private conversations, things of that nature are in Tone Chaser. So how much and how long did it take you to write this giant Bible of a book?
It took me 14 months writing every single day, probably for at least 4 or 5 hours a day. I had written 7 books previously, and the longest any of those books took me to write, I think, was, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 months. So this was an infinitely more demanding book. I had to cover 26 years. It was hard. It was a tough one to write. But at the end of the day, I was really happy with what I'd done, and the response from fans and musicians has been, pretty overwhelming. And I think they, feel the same way. So
I gotta say,
very happy with.
I gotta say, Billy Nicknames on our show, our producer, who is a musician at heart, playing a lot of different instruments, a big rock guy. He can't put the book down. Right now, as we speak, he's checking out all the glossy pictures in Tone Chaser right now. Billy, what do you think so far of Steve Rosen's book?
The pictures are great because there's
words too, Bill.
I know,
I'm just saying,
but there's other things in here, like the different things. There's a picture of the napkins from the wedding with Eddie Van Halen and Valerie Bertinelli. Things like that, like you don't see every day. You're never seen. So, like, there's, even if you just thumb through it without reading it, you'll see something.
Something's going to grab your attention to make you,
And plus, other like amazing guitar players, Ronnie Montrose, Buck, Dave Murray.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like you just latched onto Van Halen and chased him around for 26 years. You were working with many other, bands singing and writing about as well.
That was the most interesting book review I've ever heard, Bill. Thanks. The author just committed suicide, Steve Rosen. Steve, how did you end up with Eddie Van Halen and all these countless other musicians that Billy was just talking about? How did that even happen?
How did that happen? So I began writing for my high school newspaper. I was a senior at Culver City High School, and I had a little music column. So I would go out to clubs and review live shows. After high school, I went to UCLA for a year, took some English. That was a miserable experience, and I write about that in the book.
Usually it is.
So I left UCLA after a year and just thought, well, you know what, man? I like to write. I'm a voracious reader. I play guitar. I know a lot about music. Maybe I could, do like, music magazines, right? I could write for music magazines.
Like Rolling Stone and stuff like that, or?
Eventually, I got into Rolling Stone. I wrote 3 stories for Rolling Stone. I eventually wrote for Guitar Player, Guitar World, Cream, Circus, Zoo World.
So you're not some so for anyone who doesn't know who you are, you're not some like hacky fly-by-night kind of guy who wrote a book about friggin' Eddie Van Halen. This is a guy who is a music journalist who has gone out of his way and cultivated a career And part of his career at the same time was hanging out with, I don't know, arguably one of the greatest fucking guitar players in the world.
True.
That's exactly true.
Yeah.
That's right. So, so when I was hanging out with Ed for all those years, yes, it wasn't as if I was just, as you'd said, chasing him around or just hanging out with Ed, interviewing him. Around that same time, I was interviewing, it's hard for me to remember chronology, but I had
Richie Blackmore.
Just interviewed Zeppelin.
Yeah, I was going to say, just throw out all the big names. You don't have to do it chronologically. Just throw out all the big names that you got to hang out with, Steve.
The Who, Purple, Stevie Wonder, Paul Kossoff, Bad Company, Ted Nugent, Gary Moore, Michael Jackson, Albert Lee, Supertramp, Brian May, Rory Gallagher, Zakk Wylde, Steve Vai.
And that was just on a Sunday.
Zappa.
You should see what he did during the week.
Exactly.
Hey, could you settle an argument for me? Did he play?
Wait, Joe, he can't hear you because all you do is yell. Hold on, Steve, hold on. Joe wants to ask you a question. He wants you to settle some argument. Let me just apologize now because I have no clue what the fuck he's talking
if you
about.
let me fucking talk, shut your fucking mouth for a minute.
Oh, really? They're coming from you.
He just keeps going. No, I just wanted to know, did Van Halen do the lead guitar work on Beat It? Was that his line? For Michael Jackson's song?
I'm sorry. Could you repeat that? It's a little hard to hear you.
Yes, because Joe mumbles. Did Eddie Van Halen do the musical accompaniment to Beat It?
Michael Jackson's Beat It.
No.
He played the solo.
That's what I'm talking about.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah, the solo.
So it was Steve Lukather, right?
No. Exactly. No, Ed only played the solo, and Ed suggested chord changes beneath the solo. Originally, Quincy Jones had Edward just soloing over one chord.
Right.
Ed said, no, it's more interesting if you sort of use the verse changes. And for anybody who's musical, it's pretty simple changes, E to D to C. And that was Edward's idea. But those changes, that rhythm part, that that is Steve Lukather, the guitar player from Toto.
Yeah, that was the argument we had. Who did what,
Now, were you hanging out with Eddie and Michael Jackson at the time of because that's on the Thriller album, am I correct?
Yeah,
it's on Thriller.
It's on the Thriller album.
Yeah.
So were you hanging out together during that?
I wasn't. I was never in a room with Michael and Edward, but I was hanging out with Edward at the time that he did that. I interviewed Michael probably a little earlier. I interviewed Michael. Actually, it might have been right around the time of Thriller. Thriller was like 81.
Something like that, yeah.
Something like that.
82.
Okay.
82.
Ricky here on our show is the Michael Jackson historian. So when if we don't know something, we go to the Slickster.
Yeah, it was December 1st, 82 was the album release.
You see, he's like Rayman when it comes to that.
Oh yeah.
December 1st, 1982. He knows exactly. He knows what the weather was that day.
Yeah. It's funny. I did talk to Edward a little bit about doing that session, and it's a pretty funny little anecdote. So he's up in the studio, 5150, and the phone rings, and the voice says, "Can I speak to Edward Van Halen?" And Edward listened to the guy, and he thought it was like a telemarketer or something. So he hangs up, and then the guy calls back, and Ed said, he just somehow the guy got a hold of his number that this can't be anybody important. Valerie might have taken the call, or somehow this person called back again and finally convinced Edward that it was Quincy Jones.
Wow.
Asking him, says, "Hey man, you want to come play on a Michael Jackson song?" And as we all famously know, Edward played, didn't ask for any money. Thriller goes on to sell, the biggest selling record of all time, right?
Yeah,
I believe so.
It's up there.
Yeah, it's at 100 million now worldwide.
Sure.
Right. So if he had made a nickel off a record, you can do the math.
Oh yeah.
But he didn't want any money. So there you go.
All right. So he took no money for that, and he still wrote some of the greatest Van Halen songs that live on in infamy for eons now. So I'm pretty sure he was doing great with Van Halen, making money off that. Were you around, Steve? Did you get to see, and it might be in Tone Chaser, which, by the way, is the book that we're talking about, Understanding Edward, my 26-year-old journey with Edward Van Halen. You, Steve Rosen, the author of the book and musical journalist and key figure who was the fly on the wall at a lot of things. Were you a fly on the wall, speaking of Van Halen, during the whole Diamond Dave Eddie Van Halen dust-up? Like, those two did not like each other. A lot of the members of Van Halen didn't like Diamond Dave. Did you get to see any, like, backstage stuff that we're not privy to during that time frame when you were hanging out on your 26-year odyssey with Eddie Van Halen?
It wasn't so much that I saw it. Actually, I think they kept that part pretty private. But Edward revealed all of that stuff to me over the course of the time I spent with him. You know, from the very beginning, Edward and Dave really were never friends. They were just two different types of people. But Edward realized, you know, they needed a singer for the band, and, you know, the story system, and Alex said, hey, instead of us having to rent a PA system every time we do a gig, let's get him in as a singer. We'll have a built-in PA system, you know. I don't know how true that is. I'm not sure. I'm sure part of it's true. But, you know, Dave had Dave wouldn't say no, man. And there's a lot to be said about that kind of a person, you know, who just says, I'm going to be a rock star when he's still in high school. And, you know, he did it. But because of that, you know, again, there were different kinds of people. Edward did not have an outsized ego. Dave did, for good or bad. That's who Dave was. And so they never really, they weren't friends. They didn't hang out when they were off the road or when they weren't recording. And Ed would tell me stories. And yes, later it got worse. And around 1984, they came out with this monster record. And it really falls apart, and Dave quits the band. And how do you quit a band when you're at the zenith?
Right.
You know, how do you do that? Why would you do that? But obviously Dave wanted something different. He wanted a solo career. And so enter Sammy Hagar, Van Halen Mach 2.
And then you get Van Hagar, which is a different band. Yeah. Now, was your conversations about, you know, the Diamond Dave stuff that you had with Eddie, is that in Tone Chaser?
It is
beautiful,
and what you have to understand is that Edward was telling me those things in real time. In other words, you know, 1983, he was, you know, we'd have a conversation, and you know, he'd be talking about Dave, and you know, he would tell me, "Don't print any of this," and let me go back just a little bit. So in 1985, I was going to write Edward's authorized biography. We signed simple contracts, and there are copies of the contracts in the little photo section there. That book never happened, of course. But so we had lots of interviews. So Edward would say to me, hey, man, don't print this, or you can't use that, meaning I couldn't use it for the book. But also I was doing interviews with him for a lot of different magazines, and he didn't want me to print that. And understandably so. An interview coming out in 1983 where he's, you know, maybe saying some not so nice things about Dave, you know, in the middle of them recording a record and this and that would not have been a good thing, right? The label would have gone insane. So he was telling me all these things back then, and I never wrote about any of that. I never used any of that stuff.
Did he call him... Steve, did he call him, like, did he have a name for him? Did he call him, like, Diamond Douchebag or something? Or did he just always refer to him as Dave?
He just called him Dave. You know, it wasn't, he wasn't the kind of guy to kind of, you know, come up with a nickname for a guy. He was just, they were just different kinds of people, you know, didn't get, go ahead.
No, because that's why I think that people should read Tone Chaser, because I know the Eddie Van Halen that I have in my brain. Like, and that might not be the guy that actually existed out in the world that you got to be a part of and you got to hang out with, because I looked at Eddie Van Halen is like one of the greatest guitar players ever, arguably, I think maybe even the greatest guitar player ever, because he invented new ways to do shit. He played things with power tools. He had some weird fucking shit that he used to do. My thing is that that's like one aspect of, Eddie Van Halen. Then you go all through this Tone Chaser, totally like 360 out of it, and you have a totally different viewpoint. Like Billy was bringing up the napkins from the wedding.
Right. You get that personal touch instead of that star on stage.
That's what I'm saying. You got to hang out with Eddie and probably Valerie Bertinelli and everything else. Were you at the wedding?
I was at both. I was at Val and Edwards, and I was at Alex and Kelly. What's her name? Or Susan? I can't remember the name of his first wife. Yeah, I was at both their weddings. Yeah, but you bring up that matchbook. Yeah, I thought people would love that stuff.
Yeah,
that's what I'm saying.
The napkin. Yeah, you've never seen stuff like that, and I happen to have that stuff. But yes, you're right in your observation. Edward Van Halen was not the person that you saw on stage in concert, nor was he the person that you listened to on record. He was that person. He was an extraordinary musician, and certainly, if not the greatest guitar player in the world, certainly the top 5. But he was many other kinds of people, and that's the kind of person I wanted to try to explain to the reader that yes, he was more than just that extraordinary figure up on stage that we all know.
Yeah.
He had a lot of other sides to him, and that's the kind of that's the book I wanted to write, to kind of let somebody understand who that other person was.
Steve, Billy has a question for you. This is the guy that cannot put down Tone Chaser. He's literally looking at it as we speak. So, Billy, please give your question to Steve Rosen, the author of Tone Chaser, please.
All righty. I just, you go out to interview him. Did you ever have a feeling that you would become a friend of the actual person as opposed to, just being the person who interviews him? And at what point do you think that happened where he felt you were close enough that he could, tell you things that he would tell a friend?
You stopped being a reporter. You started to be his friend. When did that happen?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, man.
Billy's he's an interesting guy, Billy.
Not to me.
So he comes up with some good questions now and then.
Yeah. I mean, part of me says the first time I met Edward was June 1977. I'm at the Whiskey A Go-Go to see Cheap Trick record a live record. Yeah. I am introduced to Edward by Michelle Meyer. Michelle Meyer was the girl who booked the Whiskey. She was somebody I knew previous to that. I was in a band at the time, and she booked my band into some clubs, and she knew everything that was worth knowing musically in Hollywood. And she said, "Listen, you got to meet this guy. He's an unbelievable guitar player." So I meet Edward that first night, and we have a conversation, and it's an amazing conversation. It's like we had known each other, and I'm not like one of these, hippie people about, destiny or anything like that, man. But it's like we were continuing a conversation that we had started a long time before. Cool. We had so many things in common, and I was just so comfortable with the guy. So part of me wants to say, you know what? I think our friendship kind of really began that night, and I think it grew. In answer to your question specifically, I don't think it took long for Edward to really trust me and to open up with things that he was telling me. And in the book, again, it's difficult for me to remember the exact chronology, but I think within a year or 2 years. I mean, some of these conversations are pretty deep and personal. And they're what I call, these really deep conversations are what I call the twilight tapes. Because Edward would call me at 3 a.m. and he wanted to talk. And sometimes it was about music, but more times than not, it would be about his family or the band, or he was feeling a certain way. And it was deep, man. It was really personal stuff. And we got into those conversations, I mean, pretty early on in the in the friendship. And then in 85, so I had known him about 8 years at that time, that's when I asked him, I go, Ed, listen, man, writers are going to come to you. They're going to want to write your life story. I'd like to be the person to do that. And he goes, yeah, man, of course it would be you. Who else would it be?
Nice.
And that was pretty remarkable hearing him say that. Unfortunately, again, that book never happened because I could never get Edward to kind of sit down and do all of the interviews that I needed to do with him to talk about exactly these kinds of things, not musical so much as, Ed, so what was it like when you were 12 years old growing up in Amsterdam? And, you know, what was your relationship really like with your brother when you were young? And, you know, did you start smoking when you were 12? And, you know, were you drinking? And what was the relationship like between your mother and father? You know, all this stuff, honestly, to this day, no one ever knows. He's never really talked about that. Alex is the last one who knows, and we know that he has written a book that will be out in October. And, you know, hopefully those questions will be answered. But, yeah, man, in answering your question, I don't think it was very long into the friendship before it kind of got pretty deep, you know, where I could kind of open up, you know, I could open up to him as well and know that he was going to, you know, understand it and not, you know, make some comment that was going to hurt me or something, you know.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, that's why we're talking to Steve Rosen, by the way, the author of Tone Chaser, which is the next best thing to an autobiography of Eddie Van Halen, celebrating the 26-year love, laughter, and friendship of Steve and I'm holding this giant book. It's like and Eddie Van Halen hanging out and everything else that went on. Now, you were around during Eddie's, like we talked about, you were at the wedding to Valerie Bertinelli. I have a question, though, Steve. I got to ask this question. Now, Valerie Bertinelli, I understand you're on the road, you're Van Halen, you're out there, you're partying all the time. You had to be privy, Steve. You had to have seen that he had a hot, sexy wife at home, but he had to be you had to be there on many a time to see the side poon that was out there throwing themselves at Eddie Van Halen. Was he a womanizer? I have to ask you this question. I want to know, was he a womanizer? Because we know that they ended up getting divorced. We know that the fairy tale ending doesn't happen, so you have to be privy to some of the stuff that was going on.
Well, I mean, again, in answer to that question, I only went on the road with the band once.
It's just enough to see the poon. Come on, Steve. It's just enough.
Yeah. I honestly, when I was there, this is '86. All he did was go back to his hotel room and play guitar. And I sat there and watched him work on a riff for literally 6 hours in a row.
See?
They truly loved and adored each other, you know, and I don't say that lightly. I saw it, you know, whenever she was at home, when I was up at 5150, it was palatable. It was tangible. I mean, you could feel it. They really cared for one another. You know, you have two major celebrities, you know, and time goes on, and I think in their own ways they both needed a lot from each other. No, I don't think Ed was a womanizer in that aspect of it. Look, later on, maybe when the marriage was ending, things may have happened. I never saw it. He never talked to me about, oh, hey, man, I met this girl on the road. It was never, ever anything like that.
Well, Steve,
it honestly wasn't, man.
I believe you. But the one thing I've learned right now from having this interview with you is I know jack shit about Eddie Van Halen, and I need to now read Tone Chaser, your book, to discover the man behind the myth that's in my head of what I thought Eddie Van Halen was doing. So I thank you for writing this giant phone book of a book with these beautiful glossy pictures in the middle that captivate Billy. He's staring at it like he just discovered fire. He loves it. He can't put it down.
Different passages in the book.
Exactly. Steve, I need you. We're going to close out this interview. I need you to tell me, where can they pick up the book? Where can they see you? Where can they hear about you? Tell me everything. Plug away, my friend.
Well, very cool, man. Well, thank you. So for those who don't have the book, you can find it on my website. Very simple, tonechaserbook.com. one word, tonechaserbook.com. You can find it there. You can also find it on Amazon, Reverb, eBay, and Etsy. If any of you guys out there, any women out there, want a handmade purse and you need a book to go inside it, go check out Etsy.
There you go.
There you go. I am going to be at a record swap meet, excuse me, on Saturday, June 1st, at the Marriott Hotel and Convention Center, located at 2500 North Hollywood Way in Burbank, California. I will be there at 12 noon. I'll be selling and signing books, and I'll have some other goodies for you that will only be available there. What else can I tell you? On June 15th, I will be at the Orange County Fairgrounds at the guitar show. If you just kind of Google Orange County Fair, June 15th, you'll see the days and the times, and that's on a Saturday, June 15th. I have some other things coming up, and I can't really talk about quite yet.
Well, that's why you got to drive them to your website, Steve. You can't have them. You can't just sit here and plug everything. You got to make them go to your website because that's how they're going to learn how they can get Tone Chaser, which is your book. That's how you do it. That's how you sell stuff, baby. That's what you do.
Oh, is that how you do it?
That's how you do it, Steve. Come on. This is what we're doing. You're a mover.
I think there's a couple of books off the shelves
Thanks for letting me know, bud.
Exactly. This is what I'm saying. And I want people to go to the website and experience the stuff. I also want, Steve, I need you to send me some of those napkins from the wedding.
Oh, yeah.
I'd like to have them.
Yeah, exactly. I wish I had a couple dozen of them, man. I put them up on eBay, man.
Yeah, you should frame that shit. Ladies and gentlemen, the one and only Steve Rosen, author of the book Tone Chaser, the 26-year journey with his best friend, his bosom buddy, Eddie Van Halen. Rest in peace, Eddie. And you need to learn more about Eddie Van Halen in this book called Tone Chaser. Thank you very much, Steve, for being on the show, baby.
Thanks a lot, guys.